He waited until the toast. That was the thing about my father. He never struck when you were braced for it. He waited until every glass was raised, until the string quartet had just finished their last note, until every eye in that ballroom was soft with champagne and sentiment. Then, he cleared his throat into the microphone and said, with this warm, generous smile that everyone always believed, "I want to thank everyone who made tonight possible. My beautiful daughter Christina, her wonderful husband David, and of course, my wife Elena, the heart of this family." He paused, let the applause swell. Then he looked directly at me, 3 tables back, seated between 2 cousins who hadn't spoken to me in years, and added, "And somewhere out there is my other daughter, Natalie, who I'm sure is also very proud of her sister tonight." Somewhere out there. 214 people laughed. Not cruel laughter. Worse. The polite, uncomfortable kind. The kind that says, we all know she's the lesser one, and isn't it gracious of him to mention her at all? I was wearing my dress uniform. Full-service dress, United States Army, with every ribbon and decoration I'd earned over 11 years of service, arranged in precise rows across my chest. My father looked right through it. He'd been looking right through it my whole life. But what he didn't know, what nobody at that table knew except me and my phone sitting silent in my clutch, was that in approximately 40 minutes, a convoy of black Suburbans was going to pull into the country club parking lot, and the people inside those vehicles were not there for the wedding. They were there for me. My name is Natalie Brennan. I'm 33 years old. I'm a captain in the United States Army, and as of 6 weeks before my sister's wedding, I was the recipient of something my father would have to read about in a newspaper, because I certainly wasn't going to tell him first. This is the story of the night my father's favorite joke stopped being funny. Not because I made a scene, not because I yelled or cried or threw champagne in his face, though God knows I'd imagined all 3 over the years. It stopped being funny because the truth walked into the room, and it was louder than anything he'd ever said about me. But I need to go back, because you won't understand the toast or the convoy or the silence that came after, unless you understand what it was like to grow up as the wrong daughter in a family that only had room for one right one. I grew up in Falls Church, Virginia, in a brick colonial with green shutters that my father kept immaculate, because image was the only religion he actually practiced. Colonel Richard Brennan, retired, United States Marine Corps. 22 years of service, a Silver Star from the Gulf War, and a retirement ceremony at Quantico that I watched from the 3rd row at age 9, not fully understanding why my mother was crying. He was the kind of man other men described as impressive. 6'2", handshake like a vice, voice that filled a room without trying. At neighborhood barbecues, at church, at my sister's swim meets, he was always the center. Always performing, though he would have hated that word. Marines don't perform, Natalie. Marines execute. He had 2 daughters and no sons, which he treated as a cosmic joke God had played on him. Christina, 3 years older than me, was his answer to the joke. She was beautiful in the way that made strangers comment on it to my mother in grocery stores. Blonde, tall, an athlete, with my father's confidence and my mother's ability to make everyone feel like the most important person in the room. She swam competitively through high school, went to the University of Virginia on a partial scholarship, married a corporate attorney named David Mercer at 27, and by the night of her wedding had already given my father the thing he wanted most in the world, which was someone to be proud of in public. Then there was me. I was not tall, I was not blonde. I was quiet in a way that people mistook for shyness, but was actually observation. I had my mother's dark hair and my grandmother's build, compact and strong, and I spent most of my childhood reading in my room or sitting in the backyard with my grandfather, my mother's father, A man named Joseph Kowalski, who had served in Vietnam and never once talked about it unless you asked exactly the right question. Grandpa Joe was the person who saw me. Not the way my father looked at me, which was like checking a box on a form and finding it blank. Grandpa Joe looked at me the way you look at something growing in a garden that nobody else has noticed yet. He'd sit in his lawn chair with his coffee, black, no sugar, and I'd sit on the grass beside him, and sometimes we'd go 30 minutes without speaking. Then he'd say something that would stay in my head for years. The one I carried longest, the one that came back to me in a Humvee in Kandahar province with dust in my teeth and my hands shaking, was this. He said it when I was 12, after I came home from school having been picked last for teams again, a thing that shouldn't have mattered, but did. I was sitting on his porch trying not to cry, and he was sharpening a pocket knife on a whetstone, slow and steady, the sound like a whisper. He looked at me over his glasses and said, "Natalie, a blade doesn't announce itself. It just stays sharp. And when the time comes, it does what it was made to do." I didn't understand it then. I thought he was just talking about the knife. He wasn't. I should tell you what I actually am, because it matters for what comes later. My name is Natalie Brennan. I'm 34 years old. I hold the rank of Major in the United States Army Special Forces, which is a sentence that still makes my father's left eye twitch every time someone says it in his presence. Not because he's proud, because he genuinely cannot process it. I'm 5'6", 138 pounds. I have my mother's narrow wrists and my grandmother's light brown hair, which I keep in a regulation bun so tight it gives me headaches by 1400 hours every single day. I don't look like what people picture when they hear Special Forces. I know this because people have told me directly to my face more times than I can count. At a briefing in Fort Bragg, a colonel I'd never met looked at me and asked if I was there to take notes. I was there to brief him on a target package I'd built from scratch over 4 months of intelligence work that led to the capture of a regional IED cell leader in Helmand Province. I briefed him. He didn't apologize. I didn't need him to. That's the thing people misunderstand. They think a woman in my position must be angry all the time, walking around with clenched fists and something to prove. I'm not angry. I'm busy. There's a difference. I was one of the first women to complete the Special Forces qualification course after the ban was lifted. Not the very first. Third. The first two were extraordinary and took most of the media attention, which suited me fine. I passed the same exercises, carried the same rucksack weight, completed the same land navigation courses in the dark pine forests of Camp McCall, with the same red clay mud filling my boots. The only concession anyone made for me was a separate shower tent, and half the time I didn't bother using it because the line for the shared one was shorter. I specialized in unconventional warfare and foreign internal defense. In plain English, that means I trained partner forces in places most Americans can't find on a map, and operated in small teams in situations where conventional troops couldn't go or weren't supposed to be. My last deployment before the wedding was 18 months advising Kurdish Peshmerga units in northern Iraq, living in a compound with no running water and a goat that kept eating our communications cables. I lost 11 pounds on that deployment. I gained a reputation for being the officer who could sit with village elders for 6 hours drinking tea without losing patience, and then turn around and call in a precision airstrike with a margin of error that made my battalion commander use the word surgical in my evaluation. I'm telling you this not to impress you. I'm telling you because my father has never asked me a single question about any of it. Not one. Not, what do you do exactly? Not, are you safe? Not, what is it like? In 13 years of military service, 2 combat deployments, a Bronze Star with Valor device, and a Purple Heart from shrapnel that's still in my left thigh and sets off airport metal detectors, my father, Frank Brennan, has never once sat across from me and said, "Tell me about your work, Natalie." He asked my sister Jessica about her real estate license. He asked her about her fiancé's dental practice. He asked her about the breed of their new puppy, a golden doodle named Biscuit, with more enthusiasm than he has ever shown about anything I have done in uniform. And here's the thing. I don't look like a soldier when I'm home, I know that. I come back to Fayetteville, and I put on jeans and a soft sweater, and I help my mother make sweet tea, and I sit on the porch, and I'm quiet. I've always been quiet. Jessica is the talker, the sparkler, the one who fills a room just by walking into it, and I love her for that. Genuinely. She is not the villain of this story. She is my younger sister, and she has never once been cruel to me on purpose. But she is the daughter my father sees. She is the one he introduces first. She is the one whose photograph is on his desk at the insurance office downtown, framed in silver, smiling in her graduation gown. My photo is there too. It's behind the printer. Grandpa Joe saw it once, the year before he died. He'd gone into my father's office to drop off some paperwork, and he saw the arrangement. Jessica front and center in silver, me half hidden behind a brother inkjet. He didn't say anything to my father about it. He told me about it later, sitting on his porch, and the only thing he said was, "You remember what I told you about blades?" I said, "Yes." He nodded once and went back to his whittling. The shrapnel in my thigh aches when the weather changes. It ached the morning I flew home for Jessica's wedding. I remember rubbing my leg on the plane, looking out the window at the Carolina pines coming into view below, feeling that familiar tightness in my chest. Not from the shrapnel, from knowing that I was about to walk back into a house where the most dangerous thing I'd ever done would be treated as less interesting than a golden doodle named Biscuit. I landed at Raleigh-Durham on a Thursday afternoon in late October. The trees along I-40 were burning orange and red, that particular Carolina autumn that looks like someone set the whole state on fire in the most beautiful way possible. I had 36 hours of leave. 36 hours to attend my sister's rehearsal dinner, her wedding, and get back to Bragg before Monday formation. I'd requested a full week. My commanding officer had approved it. Then a joint training exercise with Polish Grom got moved up, and I cut it down myself because that's what you do. You don't skip a combined readiness drill because your sister is having a swan ice sculpture at her reception. My mother picked me up at arrivals. She looked good. Thinner than last time, her hair shorter, a new shade of blonde that Jessica had probably chosen for her. She hugged me in that way she always did, quick and tight, like she was trying to get it over with before anyone noticed she was being affectionate. On the drive to the house, she caught me up on everything. The florist had sent the wrong shade of blush for the peonies. Jessica had cried for 2 hours. The groomsmen's suits had to be retailored because Todd's best man had gained 15 pounds. Todd's mother wanted to read a poem she'd written herself during the ceremony, and Jessica was trying to find a polite way to say, absolutely not. Normal things. Wedding things. My mother told me all of this without once asking about my deployment. I'd been back from Syria for 11 weeks. She didn't know I'd been in Syria. She thought I was doing administrative work at Fort Bragg because that's what my father had told her I did, and she'd never questioned it, and I'd never corrected it because you don't talk about where you've been when where you've been is classified, and also because after a while you just stop trying to fill a silence that nobody notices. We pulled into the driveway, and the house was chaos. Garment bags everywhere. A woman I didn't recognize was steaming something in the living room. Jessica came down the stairs in a silk robe, with her initials monogrammed on the pocket, and she hugged me and said, "Oh my God, Megan, you're so tan. Were you at the beach?" And I said something like, "Yeah, something like that." And she said, "Well, we need to talk about your hair because the updos are supposed to match, and yours is so short now." My hair was short because long hair is a liability in the field. I told her I'd work with whatever the stylist could do. My father was in the backyard with Todd's father, standing by a rented smoker the size of a Volkswagen. He was wearing a polo shirt with the country club logo and holding a beer and laughing about something. When I walked out through the sliding door, he looked at me and raised his bottle and said, "There she is, my little soldier girl." Todd's father, a man named Gene Whitfield, who owned a chain of Toyota dealerships across eastern North Carolina, shook my hand and said, "I hear you're in the Army. That's really something." My father jumped in before I could respond. He said she does support work, logistics stuff, keeps the trains running on time. Gene nodded politely and said, "Well, that's important too." The word "too" did more damage than he knew. That was the first episode, the casual erasure. My father standing in his backyard in Cary, North Carolina, telling a stranger that his daughter, who had earned a Special Forces tab, who had completed combat diver qualification, who had been awarded a Bronze Star with Valor device, that was sitting in a drawer at Bragg because she couldn't display it at home without questions, that this daughter did logistics stuff. He wasn't lying out of malice, not exactly. He was lying because the truth didn't fit the story he wanted to tell. The story he wanted was 2 daughters, one who married well and one who had a steady government job. The truth, that his quiet daughter had been in firefights, that she'd made decisions in the dark that kept people alive, that she spoke 2 languages and could strip a weapon blindfolded. That truth was inconvenient. It didn't go with the polo shirt and the smoker and the Toyota dealership handshake. The second episode came at the rehearsal dinner. The restaurant was a place called Heron's at the Umstead Hotel. White tablecloths, small plates, the kind of place where they describe each course like it's a biography. Todd's family was there. My mother's sisters were there. My father stood up to give a toast. He talked for 6 minutes. I know because I watched the second hand on my watch. He talked about Jessica's first dance recital, about Jessica's college graduation, summa cum laude, which he mentioned twice. About the day she met Todd at a friend's lake house, about what a beautiful life they were going to build together. Then, at the end, almost as a footnote, he glanced my way and said, "And of course, we're proud of all our kids," and he lifted his glass. All our kids, plural, as if there were 5 of us and I was somewhere in the middle, indistinct. I was his only other child. He could have said Megan's name. He could have said my daughter who serves. He didn't. Jessica got 6 minutes. I got a pronoun. I didn't react. I lifted my glass with everyone else. My Aunt Dorothy, my mother's older sister, caught my eye across the table. She didn't say anything, but her face said what her mouth wouldn't, which was, "I see this, and I'm sorry." I gave her a small nod and drank my wine. The third episode was the morning of the wedding. We were all getting ready at the house. The photographer, a woman named Claire with a gentle voice and a cannon around her neck, was taking getting ready shots. She arranged the bridesmaids around Jessica. She arranged my mother adjusting Jessica's veil. Then she turned to me and said, "Let's get one of you in your dress blues. That would be stunning." And before I could answer, my father walked through the room and said, "Oh, she's not wearing those. She's wearing a bridesmaid dress like everyone else. We don't need to turn this into a military event." Claire looked at me. I looked at my father. He'd already kept walking, heading toward the kitchen, the matter settled in his mind without ever landing in mine. I was wearing a bridesmaid dress. I'd never planned to wear my dress blues. But he didn't know that, and he didn't ask. He made the decision in front of a stranger as if I were a child who might show up in a costume. And the thing that cut deepest was the phrase, military event, spoken with the same tone you'd use for something embarrassing, like a loud uncle or a political bumper sticker, as if my service were a social inconvenience. The fourth episode, the one I almost broke on. It was 40 minutes before the ceremony. Everyone was in the bridal suite at the venue, a converted estate outside Chapel Hill with white columns and boxwood hedges that smelled like money. Jessica was having her final lipstick applied. My mother was fussing with corsages. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my team sergeant back at Bragg. It said simply, "Thinking of you, Lieutenant. The boys say hi. Sergeant Reeves says don't let the civilians get to you." I smiled at my phone. My father saw me smiling and said, "Who's that? Your boyfriend?" And I said, "No, just some people from work." And he chuckled and said, "Must be nice to have a job where you can just text all day." And Jessica laughed, not cruelly, but reflexively, the way you laugh at your father's jokes because you've always been rewarded for it. I put my phone away. I stood by the window. Outside, the groundskeepers were setting the last chairs on the lawn. I pressed my thumb into my thigh where the shrapnel sat and felt the dull, familiar ache, and I thought about what Grandpa Edward had said about the blade. I could have spoken. I could have turned around and told them. I could have said I don't text all day. I spent last Tuesday teaching a partner force how to clear a building without dying in it. I could have said, the person texting me has saved my life twice, and I've saved his once, and we don't keep score because that's not how it works. I could have said a lot of things. But I looked at Jessica in her white dress and her perfect lipstick, and I thought, this is her day, and whatever I say will become about me, and I won't do that. So I smoothed my bridesmaid dress and said nothing. Again. That night after the rehearsal dinner, I sat in the rental car in the parking lot of the Hampton Inn off Route 9 in Fayetteville, and I did not start the engine. The dashboard clock said 11:42. Through the windshield, I could see the Waffle House sign buzzing yellow across the road, and a couple of soldiers in civilian clothes walking in, and I knew they were soldiers because I can always tell by the haircut and the walk and the way they hold the door for each other without thinking about it. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel. The leather was cool. It smelled like the synthetic cleaner they use on rental fleet vehicles, that fake pine smell that doesn't smell like any pine tree that ever existed. And I sat there and I let myself feel it. All of it. Not just tonight, not just my father's joke about the typing pool, or Jessica's silence, or my mother's careful look away. All of it, going back years, going back to the first time I came home on leave with the tab on my shoulder, and my father said, "Well, I hope they didn't lower the standards too much." I did not cry. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect the crying scene in the car, and I want to tell you what actually happened. What actually happened is I sat there, and I felt something settle inside me, like silt falling to the bottom of a glass of water, and when it settled, the water was perfectly clear, and I could see all the way to the bottom. I saw that my father was never going to change. That was the first thing I saw, and it was so obvious that I almost laughed. He was 63 years old. He had spent 40 years believing certain things about what women could and could not do, and the fact that his own daughter had disproved every single one of those beliefs had not moved him 1 inch, because he had decided long ago that I was the exception that proved the rule. Or maybe not even the exception. Maybe just a woman playing dress-up in a world that tolerated her presence out of politeness. And no amount of evidence would change that. Not the Bronze Star, not the deployments, not the soldiers who would walk through a wall if I asked them to. None of it. Because he didn't want to see it. And you cannot make someone see something they have built their entire identity around not seeing. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I looked at it. It was a message from Sergeant Major Rodriguez. He never texted me unless it mattered. The message said, "Ma'am, I heard you're back in Fayetteville for your sister's wedding. Some of us are at Husk Hardware on Hay Street if you want to stop by. No pressure. Just wanted you to know." I stared at that message for a long time. Husk Hardware House is a brew pub downtown in an old hardware store building. It's where half of Fort Liberty goes on a Friday night. I had been there 100 times. I had been there the night before my second deployment when Rodriguez bought me a Guinness and told me he'd been skeptical when they assigned a female officer to the company, and then he looked me dead in the eye and said I was wrong, and I won't be wrong about you again. And that was the last time either of us ever mentioned it. I did not go to the bar, but I read that message 3 more times and something in my chest unlocked. Not warmth exactly. Recognition. The recognition that there were 200 people at Fort Liberty who knew exactly who I was and what I had done, and not one of them had ever questioned it. And then there was my family who had watched me grow up, and they could not see me at all. That was when I understood what Grandpa Edward had meant. Silence is the strongest blade in your belt, but you have to know when to draw it. He didn't say silence forever. He said you have to know when. And sitting in that parking lot with the Waffle House sign buzzing and the fake pine smell and Rodriguez's message glowing on my phone, I knew. The blade was ready. The time was close. Not tonight, not at the rehearsal dinner, not during the wedding itself, but soon, and on my terms, and in a way that no one could dismiss or redirect or laugh off. I started the car. I drove back to the hotel. I brushed my teeth, and I hung up the bridesmaid dress, and I lay down on the stiff hotel sheets, and I stared at the popcorn ceiling, and I made a decision. I was done explaining. I was done proving. I was done offering pieces of myself to people who used them as coasters. Tomorrow I would stand next to my sister and smile and hold her bouquet and be exactly what they expected me to be. The quiet daughter. The one who texts all day. The one who does something with computers in the army. But after tomorrow, I would stop being invisible. Not with anger, not with a scene. With the truth, delivered once, clearly, in a room where it could not be ignored. And if my father could not handle the truth, then that would be his problem to carry, not mine. I had carried enough. I had carried 80 pounds through the Petch Valley. I had carried a wounded sergeant on my back for 400 meters under fire. I had carried my family's indifference for 15 years without dropping it. I was done carrying things for people who never once asked if my arms were tired. I set my alarm for 6. I closed my eyes. I slept like I sleep before a mission, deep and immediate and total. Because the decision had been made, and there was nothing left to do but execute. I woke before the alarm, 5:42. My body had been doing that for 12 years, waking before the noise, already alert, already scanning. The hotel room was cold. I had left the window cracked because I cannot sleep in sealed rooms anymore. Not since Kunar Province. Not since the night our outpost lost ventilation during a mortar attack, and we breathed dust and cordite for 6 hours in the dark. Fresh air is not a preference. It is a requirement. I lay still for 90 seconds, running through the day. Not the wedding. The wedding was my sister's, and I intended to be present for it, fully present, smiling and genuine, because whatever Claire had become, she was still my sister, and she was marrying a man she loved, and that mattered. No, what I ran through was what would come after the reception, the part no one in my family knew about yet. I reached for my phone. 3 messages. The first from Command Sergeant Major Luis Delgado, my former platoon sergeant, now stationed at Fort Liberty. 6 words. "We are confirmed, 204. I read it twice. Then I read the second message from Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Walsh, my battalion commander, who had written something longer, something personal. She said she was proud of me. She said the unit was proud of me. She said that what the Army was doing tomorrow evening was not a favor. It was a correction of a record that should have been corrected 3 years ago, and she was sorry it had taken this long. The third message was from my lawyer, Patricia Huang, confirming that the documents had been filed with the court in Fayetteville, and copies had been sent to the address I provided, which was my father's home address in Raleigh, where he would find them on Monday when the mail arrived. A petition for legal separation of financial obligations. A formal notification that the $214,000 I had sent to the family over the past decade was being documented as gifts, not loans, and that no further transfers would be made. Clean. Final. On paper. I showered. I dressed in civilian clothes for the ceremony because Claire had asked everyone to wear soft green or cream, and I had bought a dress in soft green. A simple thing, no shine, no shape to it really, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw exactly what my father always saw. A plain woman. Broad shoulders, short nails, no earrings. The scar on my left hand from the wire in Helmand. I looked like what I was, which was a soldier in a dress, and for the first time in years, that did not bother me. I did not need to look like anything else. The ceremony was at 2. I arrived at 1:30 to the venue, a restored barn outside of Raleigh with white lights strung through the rafters and lavender in mason jars on every surface. Claire had taste. She always had. My mother was already there, fussing with the seating chart, and when she saw me, she smiled the way she smiles at distant relatives, warm but vague, as if she was trying to place me. "Hi, sweetheart. You look nice. Can you help move the gift table 6 inches to the left?" I moved the gift table. I adjusted the microphone stand because no one else could figure out the cable routing. I fixed the playlist on the Bluetooth speaker when it dropped the connection because the DJ's phone was on the wrong frequency. I did these things quietly, and no one thanked me, and I did not need them to. My father arrived at 1:45 in a charcoal suit, looking exactly like the man he has always been. Tall, jaw set, commanding without rank. He saw me and nodded the way you nod at a parking attendant. Catherine. That was all. Then he walked past me to Claire's dressing room, and I heard his voice change, go soft and proud, and through the door I heard him say, "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." And my chest did something complicated that I refused to let reach my face. I sat in the 4th row, not the first. My mother was in the 1st row. My father would walk Claire down the aisle. My brother Kevin, who sells pharmaceutical equipment and has never held a weapon heavier than a 9-iron, sat in the 2nd row with his wife and their 2 children. The 3rd row was Claire's friends from Duke. I was 4th row, next to a great aunt who smelled like lilacs and kept asking me if I was one of the bridesmaids. "No, ma'am," I said. "I am the sister." She patted my hand and said, "Oh, how nice." The ceremony was beautiful. I will say that honestly. Claire was radiant. Her husband, Thomas, cried when he saw her, the good kind of crying, the kind that means a man is not afraid of what he feels. The vows were personal and specific, and I could tell they had written them together, because they kept finishing each other's references. I smiled. I meant it. When they kissed, I clapped. During the cocktail hour, I stepped outside and called Delgado. He answered on the first ring. "We are set for 1900, he said. "The detail is assembling at the Marriott on Glenwood, full dress. Captain Torres is leading formation. I have spoken with General Rains, and he will make the presentation personally." I leaned against the barn wall and looked at the sky. October in North Carolina, that particular blue that looks like it was painted on. "Luis," I said, "is this too much?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Caldwell, you earned the Silver Star and a Purple Heart in combat operations that saved 11 lives. Your battalion requested a formal recognition ceremony 3 years ago, and it was delayed because of administrative backlog, and because you never once followed up, because you do not ask for things for yourself. General Rains specifically requested to present the award when he learned the original ceremony never happened. 204 soldiers volunteered to attend on a Saturday evening in dress uniform because they wanted to. Not because they were ordered, because they wanted to. So no, it is not too much. It is what should have happened in 2021. I did not say anything for a few seconds. The lavender from the barn drifted out in the breeze. "Thank you," I said. He hung up. Delgado does not do long goodbyes. I went back inside. The reception was starting. I found my seat at table 11, between my great-aunt and a college friend of Thomas's, who spent most of dinner explaining cryptocurrency to me with the confidence of someone who has never been shot at. I nodded politely. I ate the salmon. I drank 1 glass of white wine. I watched my father give his toast to Claire, watched him talk about her grace and intelligence, watched him say that she was his greatest achievement, and I felt the old wound open and close like a door in wind. It opened. It closed. I let it. Claire danced with my father to Unforgettable. My mother cried in the front row. Kevin filmed it on his phone. I watched from table 11 with my hands folded in my lap and my back straight. The way I have sat through 1,000 briefings. The way I sit when the information is hard, but the mission is clear. At 6:15, I excused myself. I went to my rental car and opened the trunk. Inside was a garment bag. I unzipped it and looked at what was inside. My Army service uniform. Pressed. Perfect. Every ribbon, every pin, every crease in place. I touched the Silver Star citation folder that Patricia had placed in a protective sleeve. I touched the Purple Heart case. I zipped the bag closed. In 45 minutes, I would change into this uniform. In 45 minutes, I would drive to the Marriott on Glenwood Avenue. In 45 minutes, 204 soldiers in full dress would be standing in formation in the ballroom, waiting for me. And a 2-star general would pin a medal on my chest in front of people who understood exactly what it cost. And at 7:30, my family would receive a text message from my brother Kevin's wife, who I had quietly told 3 days ago because she was the only one in my family who had ever asked me about my deployments. The text would contain a link to the Army's public affairs livestream, and they could watch or not watch. That was their decision. I was done making decisions for people who never made room for mine. I closed the trunk. I went back inside to watch my sister cut her cake. The cake was 3 tiers of white fondant with pale pink roses cascading down one side. My sister had spent 4 months choosing that design. I watched her hold the knife with both hands while Marcus placed his palm over hers, and I clapped when everyone clapped, and I ate a small piece when a slice was placed in front of me. Vanilla with raspberry filling. It was good cake. My father was sitting 2 tables away. He had loosened his tie and was laughing with my uncle about something, his face flushed from the champagne and the dancing. My mother was beside him, her hand on his arm the way she always rested it, like she was anchoring herself to him even when he wasn't going anywhere. He caught my eye once during the cake cutting. He raised his glass to me. A small gesture, almost warm, and if you did not know the history, you would think it was a father being affectionate with his quiet daughter in the corner. I raised my glass back. Then I checked my watch under the table. 7:15. I excused myself to use the restroom, walked past the restroom, and went to my car. I changed in the back seat the way I had changed in vehicles in 3 countries on 2 continents. Dress blues on in under 4 minutes. I checked my ribbons in the rearview mirror. The bronze star with Valor device sat in the correct position. My hair was already pinned regulation tight under the beret. I looked at my own face in the mirror, and I barely recognized the woman looking back, because she was not smiling politely, or laughing at anyone's joke, or pretending she had not heard what her father said into a microphone in front of 200 people. She was a major in the United States Army, and in 20 minutes a lieutenant general was going to shake her hand. I drove to the Marriott, 14 minutes on Glenwood, 2 lights, left on Capitol Boulevard. The parking lot was already full of vehicles with Fort Liberty stickers and unit decals. I parked and sat for 30 seconds with the engine off. My grandfather's voice came back to me the way it always did in still moments. You do not explain a tree by describing its shadow. You just let people stand under it long enough. I got out of the car and walked through the lobby. 2 sergeants from my battalion were waiting by the elevator. They saluted. I returned it. One of them, Sergeant First Class Delgado, looked at me and said quietly, "Ma'am, the whole company is here. Every single one." I nodded, because if I had spoken, I am not sure what would have come out. The ballroom doors were closed. I could hear the low murmur of 200 voices behind them. Someone on the other side called the room to attention, and the murmur stopped like someone had cut the power. The doors opened. I walked in. 204 soldiers in army dress blues stood in formation, rows that ran the length of the ballroom. The silence was total. Not the silence of my father's speech where people were listening because it was polite, but the silence of people who had been where I had been and knew what the woman walking between their rows had done to bring 11 of their brothers and sisters home alive. Lieutenant General Catherine Marchand stood at the front beside a lectern with the 18th Airborne Corps insignia. She was not smiling. She was watching me the way a leader watches someone she respects, with gravity, with recognition, with the kind of attention my father had never once pointed in my direction. I marched to the front. I reported. The general stepped forward and read the citation aloud. She read about the ambush outside Manbij. She read about the 18 hours. She read the names of the soldiers I carried and dragged and tourniqueted and refused to leave. She read that I had sustained shrapnel wounds to my left leg and continued to direct fire and coordinate evacuation. She read the phrase with complete disregard for her own safety, and I stood still and breathed and let the words exist in a room full of people who understood what they meant. Then she pinned the medal on my chest. She shook my hand. She leaned in and said something only I could hear. She said, "Your grandfather would be proud, Major." I had no idea how she knew about my grandfather, and I learned later that Sergeant Delgado had told her. I blinked once. That was all. The room erupted. Not applause the way civilians do it with polite clapping that tapers off, but the kind that comes with boots stamping and voices calling out, "Hooah!" and 200 people who had decided before I walked in that this moment belonged to me. I turned and faced them. I saw faces I had bled beside, faces I had screamed orders at in dust and darkness, faces that had carried me to an aid station when my leg gave out. These people knew me. Not the version my father described in his toast. Not the quiet one, not the one who was always so independent, not the one whose absence was a footnote. They knew the real one. At 7:31, my brother Kevin's wife sent the text message. I know this because she told me afterward that she sent it right when the general pinned the medal, because she was watching the live stream from her car in the parking lot of the wedding venue, and she was crying so hard she could barely type. The link went to my father, my mother, my sister, and Kevin. A simple message. You should watch this. Elaine is receiving the Bronze Star for valor right now. She included a screenshot of the live stream showing the 2-star general shaking my hand in a ballroom full of soldiers at attention. I did not see my father's face when he opened that message. I did not need to. I was standing in a room full of people who had already seen me, fully and without caveat, and for the first time in my life, the absence of my family in a room did not feel like a wound. It felt like a fact, a neutral fact, like weather. It is Tuesday. It is raining. My father is not here, and that is fine. The general invited me to say a few words. I had not prepared anything. I stepped to the lectern and looked out at the formation, and I said, "Everything I am, I learned from a man who planted trees in Fayetteville and never asked anyone to notice the shade. And from every single one of you who stood beside me when it mattered. I will never forget that. I will never forget any of you." I stepped back. Sergeant Delgado started the applause again. I let it wash over me like water. That evening I drove back to the hotel in Fayetteville and sat on the edge of the bed with the metal case open on the nightstand. The bronze star caught the lamplight and threw a small gold circle onto the ceiling. I watched it for a long time. I thought about calling someone. My mother, Sarah, even my father. Not because I wanted to share the moment with them, but because some part of me, the part that had been trained since childhood to report back, to seek approval, to translate accomplishment into a language my family could recognize, that part was still twitching like a phantom limb. I closed the case. I took a shower. I went to sleep. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They came in layers over the following weeks, like weather systems moving across a plain. First was silence. Complete silence from my father and from Sarah. Nobody called, nobody texted. I had expected that. What I had not expected was the call from my mother on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after the ceremony. She had seen the photographs. Not from me, from a cousin who had found them on the Fort Bragg social media page and shared them to the family group chat, the one I had been removed from years ago without anyone telling me. My mother said she had stared at the photograph of 200 soldiers standing at attention for nearly an hour. She said she did not recognize me at first because I looked so different. I asked her what she meant. She said I looked like someone who belonged somewhere. She started to cry, and I let her cry, and I did not try to fix it because it was not mine to fix. She told me things I had suspected but never confirmed. That my father had taken out a second mortgage on the Fayetteville house to pay for Sarah's wedding. That the reception alone had cost more than $60,000. That the money Sarah had told everyone was her own savings was actually a gift from our parents, nearly $40,000 on top of the wedding costs. That the college fund my grandfather had set up for both of us had been quietly redirected entirely to Sarah when I was 16, because my father had decided that a girl who wanted to join the army did not need a college fund. My mother said she had disagreed at the time. I asked her why she had not said anything. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I was afraid he would stop loving me too." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. She asked if I could forgive her. I told her I did not know yet, but that I was willing to try, and that trying was not the same as pretending. My father's response came 5 weeks after the ceremony, and it came not to me, but through Sarah. Sarah called me for the first time in 4 months. Her voice was tight and controlled, in a way that told me she had rehearsed. She said Dad saw the pictures. She said he was upset. I asked what he was upset about. She said he felt I had done it on purpose. I asked what exactly I had done on purpose. She said, "You know what you did, Ellie. Scheduling your little military thing the same weekend as my wedding and then making it into some kind of spectacle." I told her I had not scheduled anything. That the army had scheduled it. That I had received orders. She was quiet. Then she said, "Well, it still feels like you were trying to compete with me." I told her that if she genuinely believed that a combat decoration ceremony at Fort Bragg was designed to compete with her wedding reception at a Raleigh country club, Then we had very different understandings of the word competition. She hung up. My father called 2 days later. It was the first time he had called me directly in almost a year. His voice was not angry. It was worse than angry. It was the careful, measured voice he used when he believed he was being reasonable and everyone else was being emotional. He said he thought we should talk about what happened. I said, "All right." He said he had seen the photographs and he wanted me to know that he was proud of me in his own way and that he had always been proud of me, but that I needed to understand how it looked. I asked how what looked. He said, "You getting all this attention on your sister's wedding weekend. People are talking, family is talking. They are saying I don't support you and that is not true, and I need you to help me fix this." I held the phone away from my face for a moment and looked at the ceiling. I brought it back. I said, "Dad, what exactly would you like me to fix?" He said, "I need you to post something on social media, something about the wedding. Say something nice about your sister. Show people we are a family." I said, "We are not a family. We are people who share a last name and a set of memories that we apparently remember very differently." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You have always been so goddamn difficult, Eleanor, just like your grandfather." I said, "Thank you. That is the best thing you have ever said to me." He hung up. The person I did not expect to hear from was Robert, Sarah's husband. He called me on a Sunday morning about 6 weeks after everything. He was polite and awkward and clearly uncomfortable. He said he had looked me up after the wedding weekend and read about the Silver Star and the Bronze Star, and he said he felt sick about what had happened at the reception. He said he had not known. He said Sarah had always described me as the difficult one, the one who caused problems, the one who refused to be part of the family. He said he was starting to understand that the story he had been told was not the whole story. I thanked him for calling. He asked if there was anything he could do. I told him the only thing anyone could do was tell the truth when it mattered, even when it was expensive. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your sister is not a bad person." I said, "I know she is not. She is a person who was taught that love is a limited resource, and she learned to compete for it. That is not the same as being bad. It is just sad." The weeks after that phone call were quiet in a way I had not experienced in years. Not the silence of waiting for the next blow. Not the tense quiet of a forward operating base before a mission. This was something else. This was the silence of a house after you have finally finished unpacking the last box. Everything in its place. Nothing left to move. I went back to work at Fort Bragg on Monday morning. The hallways looked the same, the fluorescent lights still buzzed the same flat hum. But I walked through them differently. I noticed it in the way my boots hit the linoleum. There was no rush, no proving. I had spent 15 years walking fast through every corridor in the Army, trying to get somewhere before someone could tell me I did not belong there. Now, I just walked. Colonel Reeves called me into his office that afternoon. He closed the door, which he almost never did unless something was serious. He sat on the edge of his desk instead of behind it, which meant he was about to be human instead of official. He said he had heard from someone at the reception. He did not say who. He said he wanted me to know that what my father did had nothing to do with what I was worth, and everything to do with what my father could not see. I told him I already knew that. He nodded slowly and said, "I know you do. But sometimes knowing a thing in your head and hearing someone else say it out loud are two different kinds of knowing." He was right about that. That night, I drove to the storage unit on Yadkin Road, where I kept the things I had carried from deployment to deployment, base to base. The boxes too heavy to open and too important to throw away. I found the one I was looking for in the back corner, behind my old rucksack and a footlocker with a broken latch. It was a shoebox. Inside was a photograph, a folded letter, and a brass compass with a cracked crystal. The photograph was of my grandfather and me. I was 11 years old, standing on the bank of the Neuse River near his property in Kinston. He was crouching beside me, one hand on my shoulder, pointing at the water with the other. I do not remember what he was pointing at. A heron, maybe, or the place where the current changed direction near the fallen oak. What I remember is the weight of his hand. It was not heavy. It was steady. There is a difference. The letter was the last one he wrote me before he died. I had read it once, the day it arrived at my barracks during my first year at West Point, and then I had folded it and put it in the box and not looked at it again. I was afraid that if I read it too many times, the words would wear thin and stop meaning what they meant. That night I unfolded it under the fluorescent light of the storage unit and read it again. He wrote in his careful block letters, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write clearly because unclear writing got people killed. He wrote about the compass. He said he had carried it through Korea, through the Chosin Reservoir, through the kind of cold that made men forget their own names. He said the crystal had cracked during the retreat, but the needle still pointed true. He said he was giving it to me because I reminded him of that compass. He said, "Claire, the world will try to crack your glass. Let it. The needle is what matters. As long as you know where true north is, the cracks are just proof you survived the cold." I sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit for a long time. The air smelled like dust and motor oil, and the particular staleness of things that have been sealed away too long. I held the compass in my palm and felt the weight of it, the surprising density of brass, and I thought about my grandfather pointing at the river, and I thought about my father pointing at me in the banquet hall, saying, "Is this your idea of a career?" And I understood something I had been circling for years without landing on. My grandfather had seen me. My father had looked at me my entire life and seen something that was not there. He saw the daughter who left, the daughter who chose uniforms over family dinners, the daughter who did not come home for Thanksgiving. He saw absence, and he called it betrayal. What he never understood was that I did not leave the family. I left the version of me they had decided I was. I left the quiet girl who was supposed to stay small so that Sarah could stay golden. I left that girl on the riverbank in Kinston when I was 17 years old, and I joined the army, and I became someone my grandfather would have recognized, even if my father never could. The compass needle still moved. I checked. After all those years in a shoebox, it still found north. I closed my hand around it, and I felt something I can only describe as permission. Not from my grandfather, because he was gone. From myself. Permission to stop carrying the question of whether my father would ever see me clearly. The answer was that he might not, and that the not knowing had to be survivable, because I had survived worse. I thought about what I had said to Marcus on the phone, that Sarah was not a bad person, just a person who learned to compete for love like it was a limited resource. That was true, but it was also true of my father. He had grown up in a house where approval was currency and silence was punishment, and he had replicated that economy in his own home without ever examining the ledger. He gave what he had been given. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough, but it was all he had. I did not forgive him that night. Forgiveness is a word people use as if it is a single door you walk through, and then you are on the other side. It is not. It is a hallway with many doors, and some of them are locked, and some of them open into rooms you did not expect. That night I opened one door. The door that said, "I will not carry your opinion of me as if it is a fact about me." That was enough for one night. I put the compass in my jacket pocket. I put the photograph on the dashboard of my truck. I left the letter in the box because some things belong in storage, where they are safe and where they cannot be worn thin by too much handling. I drove back to my apartment on Post, and I sat on the porch in the dark, and I listened to the pine trees and the distant sound of helicopters returning from a night training exercise, those rotors cutting the air in a rhythm I knew better than my own heartbeat. My grandfather had been right about the compass. He had been right about all of it. The cracks were just proof I survived the cold. I sat on that porch until the stars shifted positions above me. The helicopters had gone quiet. The pine trees kept up their low conversation with the wind, the way they always did at Fort Liberty after midnight, when the Post settled into something close to peace. I could smell the red clay that never quite washed out of anything in North Carolina. It was in my boots, in the creases of my truck's floor mats, in the hem of every pair of pants I owned. That clay was honest. It stained you, and it did not pretend otherwise. I thought about my father. Not the version of him that stood in that ballroom with champagne on his shirt and silence where his authority used to be. I thought about the version from before. The one who taught me to change a tire when I was 11. The one who drove me to soccer practice for 3 years before he decided I was not worth the gasoline. People are not one thing. That is what makes forgiveness so difficult. If he had been purely cruel, I could have cut him out cleanly, the way you cut a damaged section from a climbing rope. But he was not purely cruel. He was a man who needed to feel large, and the easiest way to feel large was to make someone else feel small. And the someone he chose was his quiet daughter because she never fought back. Until she did. Not with anger, with facts. I will tell you something I did not expect. In the weeks after the wedding, after the story had circulated through family channels the way stories do, my father called me. Not to apologize. He called to tell me that I had embarrassed him, that I had orchestrated a spectacle, that a real soldier would not need 200 people to prove a point. I listened to every word. When he finished, I said, "Dad, I did not orchestrate anything. Those soldiers came because that is what units do when their commander is disrespected. I did not ask them to stand. I did not tell them to salute. They did it because they chose to." And then I said something I had been carrying for 20 years. I said, "You have never once asked me what I actually do. Not once in my entire career." And I hung up the phone, and I set it face down on my kitchen table, and I sat there in the quiet, and I did not cry. I had done my crying already, years ago, in dark vehicles and empty parking lots where no one could see. I was past that now. My sister Rachel called 2 days later. She was crying. She said she was sorry for everything, for the seating chart, for the years of letting Dad's version of things go unchallenged, for never once visiting me at any duty station. She said she had not known about the Bronze Star, about the deployments, about any of it. I believed her. That was the worst part. She had not known because she had never asked either. The whole family had agreed, without ever discussing it, that I was the minor character in our story. And I had let them believe it because fighting for their attention felt like begging. And I do not beg. I told Rachel I loved her. I meant it. I told her that love and access are two different things, and that I would need time before I could sit at a family table again, without hearing the echo of laughter that was designed to make me disappear. She said she understood. Maybe she did. Maybe she did not. Either way, she had said the words, and words are seeds. You do not know what they will grow into until later. Colonel Briggs retired the following spring. At his retirement ceremony, he pulled me aside and he said, "Connolly, your grandfather's compass. You still carry it?" I said yes. He said, "Good. You are going to need it for the next part." I asked him what the next part was, and he smiled in that way old soldiers smile when they know something you have not figured out yet. And he said, "The part where you stop proving and start living. Those are different operations, and most people never learn the difference." I think about that now, sitting here on a spring evening on the porch of a house I bought outside Southern Pines. My own house. Small, with a yard full of longleaf pines and a garden I am still learning to keep alive. The tomatoes are not cooperating, but the basil is doing fine. There is a compass on my bookshelf next to a photograph of a man in a wool coat standing in snow. The cracks in the compass glass catch the light sometimes and throw tiny rainbows on the wall. And every time I see them, I think about what my grandfather said in that kitchen in Duluth when I was 15, and the world felt impossibly large and cold. The cracks are just proof you survived the winter. Do not fill them in. They let the light through. He was right. About all of it. If you are listening to this and you are the quiet one in your family, the one whose accomplishments get skipped over, the one whose chair could be empty and no one would rearrange the table, I want you to hear me. Your silence is not weakness, but it is also not a strategy you should keep forever. There will come a moment when the room needs to know who you are. Not because you need their approval, because you deserve to take up the space you have earned. You do not have to shout. You just have to stand. The right people will stand with you. I know, because 200 of them stood with me on a Saturday night in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I never asked a single one.